Well, good evening and welcome to Commandments 1, 2, and 3. But a little broader than that, if we think of those in here who are preparing to receive sacraments that evening, particularly those who are candidates, they'll be receiving their first confession probably the morning of the Easter Vigil. Okay? And so, as always, those of us who've been Catholic for a few years, I'm afraid to say how many, in my case, confession is one of those sacraments you can always, unless you're very regularly practicing it, or you've been on a good retreat that helped you on it, it's a sacrament that requires refreshment so that you can, in a certain sense, immerse yourself into it best, and so that you can immerse yourself in the mercy of God, which is what this sacrament is all about. So as we go through the commandments in the next 3 weeks, this is kind of a standard approach to also be preparing you for examination of conscience, because those of you who are Catholics know this is probably how you do it. This is kind of the fundamental way. It's the way you learn, because the commandments represent a kind of moral bedrock, okay? It doesn't mean it's the full thing of every aspect of the moral life, but if you're violating the commandments, you're in difficulty, okay? There's no question. You're crossing that line, you've got some challenges, and we'll try to develop that a little bit as we go tonight. So tonight I thought, rather than start with a formal specific prayer, I will go through a reading or a few kind of quotes that reflect on this from a number of spiritual masters, most of whom are from the early church, but not all. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Now, I know the print here is a little small, so I'll read it out loud for those of you who are, visually challenged on this. The first few are from St. Augustine, one of my favorites. Return to your conscience. Question it. Turn inward, brethren, and in everything you do, see God as your witness. Now, if you know anything about St. Augustine, he knew a bit about sin. He was a master of it before he became a doctor of the church and one of the greatest saints. Another one from him. There we shall rest and see. We shall see and love. We shall love and praise. Behold what will be at the end without end. For what other end do we have if not to reach the kingdom which has no end? That whole sense of the sublime goal. And a long one, forgive me. While he is in the flesh, man cannot help but have at least some light sins. But do not despise these sins which we call light. If you take them for light when you weigh them, tremble when you count them. A number of light objects makes a great mass. A number of drops fills a river. A number of grain makes a heap. What then is our hope? Above all, confession. One of the most liberating things, and for those of you coming into the church, you may not have a rich appreciation for this, but this is the means we have to cope with sin. You'll often hear the phrase Catholic guilt. I would argue the opposite. Now, we can all suffer from unbalanced guilt if we let it get out of control, and we'll try to develop that a little bit over the next couple weeks too. But the real issue is, how do you deal with it? How do you deal when you fail? Now, if any of you have not failed along the way somewhere, at least in some minor way, I definitely want to meet with you after class. I'll call the Vatican. We'll get the canonization papers going now. Although usually it requires at least 5 years after you're dead to start that. Okay. Something we'll develop later. God wrote on the tables of the law, the commandments, if you will, what men did not read in their hearts. And we'll develop that a little later with this whole idea of natural law and divine law. We'll develop that. And from St. Paul's letter to Philemon, The goal of a virtuous life is to become like God. That's what this is all about. That's why we're here. From St. Paul again, charity bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Reassure our hearts before Him whenever our hearts condemn us, for God is greater than our hearts, and He knows everything. John the Apostle. Sometimes we're afraid to tell our sins to a priest. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced that. You're spiritually well above that, you know. As if God doesn't know them already. Well, why does He make us do this? Okay. I'll tell you a true story one night. I was teaching a very large class, and we got into the subject of confession. I think I had about 20 candidates coming in. I had 2 parishes combined. And there was a gentleman who sat kind of back where you do, Julia, just kind of to the outside. And he was relatively quiet. And I knew, because we had met before classes had started, and he told me, he said, look, I've been dry for 5 years, but I was a significant alcoholic, and I just want you to know that up front. He said, is that any kind of a problem? I said, no. We got to the night of confession, and sitting right about where Bart is, a wonderful guy, FBI agent at the time. He's recently retired. I think he wanted to get out of it. Very good man, lovely family. But he came from a strong Anglican background. Now, for those of you who are Catholic, again, we're just starting. Do you have any idea what question he asked me? This is probably the question I've gotten on confession more over my quarter of a century of doing this. Why do we have to tell our sins to a priest? Yeah, okay, sorry, I stole your thunder there. Okay, yeah. Well, I was about to give what I hoped was a reasonable answer. And he chimed in the back. And he said, John, do you mind if I take this? Now, if nothing else, out of curiosity, yeah, go ahead. Well, he went on and did about 4 or 5 minutes explaining to him how you can't have that. Now, if you think of, if any of you are familiar with AA, which he had been in for 5 years, what's the first thing you have to admit? Yeah, I got a problem with alcohol. You know, you got to face it, okay? And that's the first thing you got to admit. In fact, most alcoholics oftentimes have to go through, what do they call it, an intervention, I think. If I remember being called to be on one once, but it didn't happen, where you kind of bring the friends and the coworkers together and you sit down with the person and you say, look, we love you. That's why we're here. You got a problem. And most commonly, an alcoholic, unless they're ready, you've all got the problem. It's not me. That's the way it goes. You got it. Anyway, he said, and it's important to say it and to say it to other people. He says, otherwise you can con yourself. You know, the human capacity for self-deception is one of the fruits of original sin. And he laid it, he did a much better job than I just did, but he laid it out. And so I was almost sheepish turning to this very good man here. And I said, is that sufficient? And he said, oh yeah. So, and on we went. All right. So again, that whole idea, okay? Let me see, I've had some issues with my computer tonight, so see if I can scroll these properly. A couple more and then we'll move on. From St. Irenaeus, an early church father of the 2nd, 3rd century, man is rational, and therefore, like God, he is created with free will and is master over his acts. Okay? That's what being free is. We are masters of our acts. Good and the not so good. And finally, from John Paul II, conversion requires convincing of sin. It includes the interior judgment of conscience. And we'll spend a little time on conscience tonight, okay? All right. Any questions on all that madness, or did I get them all? Or, I think I got them all, okay? All right, let's move on. Let me escape this one. And I had my slides all jump tonight again. That's the second time that's happened. I'm still not sure why, but we'll get through that. So tonight we're going to be looking at commandments 1, 2, and 3. Next week, 4, 5, 6, and then the rest. A few things about the commandments we ought to understand. The commandments are actually in order of importance. Okay? That sometimes shocks people. Honor your father and your mother comes before thou shalt not kill, or murder is. We'll talk about that next week. Does that seem proper? Particularly if you think of yourself as a bratty adolescent at some point, you know. Sorry, I'm sure not you, not at all. Okay, but if I think of my adolescent days, was I guilty of breaking that commandment? Certainly. By the way, for those of you who've advanced on in age, when does that commandment become really demanding? In fact, sometimes very demanding.
When your parents are old.
Yes. When you are now responsible to care for them, as they did for you. Okay, so we'll look at these from some angles. They're in order. Now, the first 3 commandments we take tonight all have to do with our relationship with whom? Our relationship with God. Okay, so naturally, those come first. Because if we get our relationship with God right, chances are those other things will fall in place pretty easy. If that relationship struggles, and certainly in the human condition it will, then, you know, the other 7 are going to be harder. And that's kind of the way this order of the commandments is. Have any of you ever seen the movie Rudy? About the walk-on who played Notre Dame football back in the 70s and actually got in a game and, you know, so forth. So he's considered to have actually played Notre Dame football. Okay. There's a famous scene in there. He prays a lot, but he's praying to make the football team. His whole prayer life seems to be devoted to that. Okay. And he runs into this priest, a Monsignor, I don't know, who's just on campus, and he ends up kind of going to him for advice. And at one point, I forget what in the movie or the story was frustrating him that, you know, he wasn't making it, this was happening, all that. And he's talking to this priest, and he was trying to get into Notre Dame first. I think he spent 2 years trying to get in. And they discovered he was dyslexic, so that made studies difficult for him. So anyway, the story goes, he's meeting with this priest, and he had improved his grades and everything else, but he didn't get in. He had to wait another year. And he goes to this priest, and he's frustrated, and the priest says, Rudy, I've learned 2 things in the length of my priesthood. Okay? There is a God, and I'm not him. Now think about how much wisdom is buried in that simple phrase. I'm not God. When I act as if I am, when I treat myself as the center of the universe, okay, I'm not in a good place. In all relationships, don't we have to relate to people as they are and as I am? Certainly. As a married man, I can't relate to people as if I'm single. It doesn't make sense. Okay. So again, we have to do that. So man is creature, but a creature created in the image and likeness of God. You know, creature is not a lowly thing here. This is not like something that crawled out of the Black Lagoon, if you remember the old B movies from probably back in the 30s or 40s. I can't remember when. We are in a very lofty position, and we need to act like it. Created in the image and likeness of God, we are called to become like him. So the commandments are a guide to that. Well, let's start with we're going to start with a few basics before we jump into the commandments themselves. Let's start with sin. And this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1849 and 50. Again, the scriptural quotes are in red. Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. Okay? We'll define conscience shortly, okay? But I suspect most of you have some idea what it is. Okay? It is a failure in genuine love for God and neighbor, should be caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. Okay? A perverse attachment to certain goods. Did any of you give something up for Lent, but this is not a, by the way, this is not a mortal sin or anything like that, anything too serious, but you fell off the wagon? Anybody want to admit it? Okay. Can we ask what you gave up?
No.
Okay. All right. All right.
Well, okay.
No, don't. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I fell off.
Okay, you fell off.
Yes.
Screen
Screen time after 5 p.m.
time after 5 p.m. That's good. Okay. And let me guess. Look, you chose to do that because you like the screens a little too much. Okay. That's this was not an addiction I ever ran into when I first started teaching. Well, a few TV screens, kids. Computers have blown this up, poured gasoline on that fire. Okay. Can I ask, Laura, what tempted you and what made you watch something? Or
I was bored.
you were bored? Yes. Okay. Very common. Okay. We're not great in our generation, and I know you're a generation below me at least, maybe two, I don't know, but in our time, we are not good at sitting quietly, are we? Okay, I've watched my students over the 50 years or so that I taught them, and their ability to sit quietly has diminished extraordinarily in that span of time. Sometimes you can almost make them go crazy just by making them be silent. Okay, yeah. Okay, so a perverse now that sounds awfully dark, doesn't it? A perverse attachment to these things. Now, even if it's something rather trivial like screen time can become a monster. It really can. Takes us away from our responsibilities, our relationships. I hate to tell you, but screen time is boring too, I like it a bit too. I've got to watch it. But any video gamers out here? Okay, fortunately, you're obviously a very mature crowd then. But I've had students, bright kids, who academically were a mess because they're addicted to games. And you sit down with them. How much time do you spend on a night? Oh, about 3 hours. And then when you sit down and really talk, you usually find out it's more like 5 or 6. Well, how can you be a good student? And I wish I were exaggerating the numbers, but I'm not. Okay? But we get attached to anything. For me, chocolate ice cream will do it. The problem is I could probably spend as much time with it as you spend on the screen, Just keep going. All right. So it's a perverse attachment to some goods. It wounds the nature of man and injures human solidarity. It has been defined, again, sorry, my grammar here, as an utterance, a deed, or a desire contrary to the eternal law. Okay? We're going to develop that idea of the eternal law, divine law, natural law, human law in a minute. Okay? Sin is an offense against God. It isn't just an offense against neighbor. God doesn't want us to be this way. He doesn't want us to be sinning. Against you, you alone have I sinned, and done that which is evil in your sight. Sin sets itself against God. When we sin, we're setting ourselves in a small way most of the time, occasionally in a big way, against God. God's love for us and turns our hearts away from it. It is disobedience, in other words, not hearing, a revolt against God through the will to become like God's. Remember that? Original sin, Genesis 3. Knowing and determining good and evil. Okay? So when you fell off the wagon, whatever you did, Mary, you engaged some thought, probably.
Jesus would really want me to eat this.
Oh gosh, that's good, isn't it? The human mind's capacity for rationalization. Yes. Okay. Yesterday, of course, did you eat whatever it was yesterday?
Not that particular thing.
Okay.
Something else just as good.
An indulgence. Now, was yesterday okay?
Yes.
Why? Feast of St. Joseph. This is one of the higher feasts. And so on those days, we don't fast. Okay, so whatever we might give up. So last night, my wife had her first round of chemo she's going through, and we had kind of a long day. It went well, but it's a long day, doing there. First day, they take you through everything. So when I got home, later that evening, we had to go grocery shopping on the way back because we had to pick up one more prescription. And chocolate ice cream was on sale. Oh gosh, God wanted me to do this, yes, so we did it, okay? Now this, much of this comes from Aquinas and Augustine, the two greatest doctors of the church, okay? So just so we understand what sin is, and it doesn't always have to be something we do. It can be a thought, okay? It can be something we neglect to do. Think of Commandment 4 when we get there next week. We can neglect that. Okay, let's move on. So as we're going through these commandments, we want to think about our conscience, and we want to think about kind of how do we prepare. Again, a good walk through the commandments from time to time helps with that, okay? So let's take a look at this, again from the Catechism. What is the conscience? Okay. Now, who has the most famous saying in all of movies on the conscience? Does anybody remember? Those who are old enough? Jiminy Cricket. Do you remember him? Anybody remember what he said? Always let your conscience be your guide. He was an interesting movie character. He was not a great theologian, okay? Because he didn't put enough in there, okay? We'll get to that a little later. The interior voice of a human being, within whose heart the inner law of God is inscribed. In other words, it's kind of written in our hearts, in other language. Moral conscience is a judgment of practical reason about the moral quality of human action. Okay? Practical, you could probably substitute the word prudent. Prudence is required for good morality. Prudence is, you probably studied that with Father a few weeks ago, right? Or was that last week? What's prudence? Okay, quiz time here, guys. What is prudence? Do you remember? Right judgment, particularly in particular situations, okay? You can't, if you've got 6 answers and you plug them into every situation in life, you don't have enough answers, okay? Excuse me, so how do we plug into a particular circumstance, all right? Okay, where did I leave off? It moves the person at the appropriate moment to do good and avoid evil. When you were considering maybe doing something erroneous, no, sorry. When you consider doing something erroneous, do you get a little uncomfortable feeling? A little queasy? Almost you can feel it in the gut? That's the conscience at work, okay? Sometimes it's a gut feeling. You just sense, I don't know if this is a dark alley. I don't know if I want to go here, okay? Listen to that, okay? Particularly if you have a lack of certainty about something. An examination of conscience is recommended as preparation for the reception. I've put 3 of the common names now: penance, reconciliation, confession here. There are actually more names for it. I even once saw it centuries ago called the Sacrament of Happiness. I haven't heard that around a lot, but Sacrament of Happiness, okay? I've had the privilege doing RCA work over many years, now OCIA, of taking 200 and some people to their first confession. And I've seen some come out walking on clouds. I'm not saying that happens universally, it doesn't. But I have seen some people come out of that confessional floating almost. And it's a blissful thing to see, okay? Man has the right to act in conscience and in freedom so as personally to make moral decisions. You have a right to follow your conscience. Now, we'll do a little caveat on that later. We'll talk about right conscience, okay? And a certain right conscience is key here, okay? The education of a conscience is a lifelong task. So I don't know who the oldest here among us is. I know I'm among them. And as life evolves, you begin to realize things you were a bit of heel on earlier without realizing it, or the circumstances of life call for more out of us with time in terms of our moral behavior. We ought to be, crawling up the pile toward God, if you will. It prevents or cures fear. This is what developing the conscience does. Selfishness and pride, resentment arising from guilt, feelings of complacency born of human weakness and faults. Examination of conscience helps us get over things like lingering guilt and so forth. Okay. One advice I give to everybody who goes for their first confession: when the priest says the words of absolution, believe him. Your sins are forgiven. Sometimes some folks want to linger. Well, maybe I didn't express that right to Father. Did he forgive your sins? Your sins are forgiven. Again, it's not a performance in there. It's, For the man who has committed evil, the verdict of his conscience remains a pledge of conversion and of hope. When you can turn to yourself and say, I've screwed up, I've done wrong, or I failed to do good, that's the beginning of conversion. Okay? If any of you have ever been treated for a medical condition, maybe something kind of snuck up on you, and have you ever known someone medically who wanted to deny when it was apparent they were having some problems? Because they don't want to go to the doctor and find out? Yeah, because when you find out, it's not a pleasant thing. Oh, you've got cancer. Oh, you've got Parkinson's. Oh, you've got ALS. That's not a fun diagnosis. But the longer you delay, the less ability you may have to treat that condition. We need to recognize. And finally, a human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. You are required to do that. That's why it's so important that you follow it and form it, and you form it throughout life. Okay, talk about 4 types of the moral law. Okay, do we all know what we mean by moral law? Does anybody have a question what I mean by moral law as opposed to something else? What is a moral decision? What makes it moral?
That has something to do with like morality, like right and wrong.
Right and wrong, yeah, right and wrong. So for example, to eat chocolate ice cream, okay, since I think you and I might be on the same page or similar page on this.
Pretty close.
Okay. What flavor of ice cream, if you could have it above all else, would you have?
Rocky Road.
Okay, kind of a chocolate-ish. So we are pretty close, yeah. I'm a pure chocolate guy, all right? What if she said vanilla? Now, vanilla's fine if you put enough chocolate on top of it, right? No, I'm not trying to, there's probably somebody in here who loves vanilla. I mean, it goes well with other things. It does very well. And it's good. It's just not as good as chocolate, okay? Now, is that a moral decision whether you have vanilla or chocolate ice cream? No. That's an aesthetic decision, a matter of taste, okay? But moral decisions are those decisions that have to do with right, wrong, better, best even. Sometimes we forget that. To me, some of the hardest moral decisions are, what's the best thing for me to do here? And they're both good. Okay? That's where I'm not very good at making decisions sometimes. Don't ask me why. Okay, so moral law. Again, moral law is the work of divine wisdom. Now we start in God himself. So here we have the Trinity. The eternal law is that perfect wisdom, perfect morality, perfect love as it exists within God. Okay? Do you think they needed a confessional up in heaven before they got us going? No. They never had any problems. Even here, until Adam and Eve, fell off the wagon, didn't need it. There was no need. Perfect order, perfect love. Okay? Everything working the way it ought to. Divine law is that part of the eternal law which has been revealed to us. Okay? Now, where could that be? Well, Scripture. Where we find the Ten Commandments, where we find the Beatitudes, where we find the life of Christ and many other teachings. This has been revealed to us. Okay? God has shown us this. Now, you remember that little quote I read early on? I'm going to go into the natural law, and we're going to talk about that relative to the commandments. Natural law is that immutable, in other words, unchanging, eternal part of the divine law, which is discernible by human reason without revelation. So let's say that you grew up in, pick a country with no Judeo-Christian heritage. Okay, now Islam unfortunately builds off of it. There's a little bit there, but you're not bad. I'm trying to think of all 8 people who live there too. Okay, let's pick on Greenland. Let's say they've never heard of Christ. Nothing Judeo-Christian. I'm sure that's not the case, but okay. Let's go with Greenland. It's so light in population, we could pretend that. Plus, they're too cold to read or something. Okay. All right. These people, do you think they would know, assuming they were reasonably virtuous people, natural virtue, do you think they would know it's not a good idea to kill each other? Yeah, you'd wipe out half the population with one murder. Do you think they know it is not a good idea to steal? Okay. To lie? Okay. Does that kind of paint the picture? Yeah. They didn't need revelation to tell them this. If we look at the 10 Commandments, they are largely natural law. But natural law that the Jews, unfortunately, had kind of lost grip on. And lo and behold, God gave them the commandments to kind of pull them back. Okay? They had gone off the wagon. So natural law. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, particularly back in the 80s, I would argue, but even earlier in the 70s, when abortion became legal in the United States, there was a lot of arguments that surrounded this issue, and you had people arguing against the legalization of abortion based on the natural law arguments. Okay? You don't have to be a Christian to know this is not a good idea. Okay? But the other side tried to say, you're imposing your moral teachings on the rest of us. That was kind of the early arguments. And they're still around today. You'll hear those. But no, why did they want to get rid of the moral law? Because then you can kind of make it up on your own. When natural law disappears, when that aspect, it's hard for a society that has any diversity of religion and faith and belief in it to function. And that might explain why we have some of the difficulties we have in our country. Okay, it's a great country, but having some challenges. Okay, human law. All right, has anyone in here ever broken a human law? Julia, okay. Jaywalking, very good. How many of you have ever jaywalked? In other words, cross the street, not on the not at the corner. Okay, you're all jaywalkers. Whew. Life in prison. No. Okay. Can you think of any other laws? Speeding. Yeah, me too. Not often, but a couple times. I'm not going to, sounds like personal confessions here we're getting into. How many of you have been filling out your taxes recently? Okay, a joyous experience, isn't it? It's better than it used to be, but it's still not easy. Okay. Do you ever get frustrated with government when you fill out your taxes? Yeah. Okay. Sometimes you may want to break the law when you're filling out taxes, you know. I gave a talk at a parish over in St. Paul early in the year, and I was happy to do it. It was a topic I was familiar with. The priest said, I want to pay you. I said, Father, don't, just let me do it. No, I want to pay you. So I go over there to give the talk, and he makes me fill out, was it W-9 or whatever, you know, when you do. I think I got paid $150 to give this talk. And we'd kind of forgotten about it. My wife does the taxes. She's got kind of an accounting background, and she's going through this. And it was one of those things. I almost lost money by getting paid because it just enough to bump me into the next bracket. And it was pretty well wiped out. So she looked at me. I said, from now on, I will never do them unless it's a stipend. I'll take a stipend. Yeah, I will walk away or something. Hopefully that's legal. But okay, human law, is it always in conformity with God's law, with natural law? It should be. Okay, each one of these should be, informed by the one above. The legalization of abortion is a good example of human law. It's legal, but it's not proper. Okay? Can you think of any other laws that might, human laws that you and I live under here, living in the state of Minnesota, that we might say, a sober mind would not have this as a law? Death penalty. Yeah, we don't have that here, but that does exist in some places. And in some places, not so much in the United States, but in some countries, that's liberally handed out. And that certainly doesn't square with Catholic thought, okay? The death penalty is not absolutely forbidden in Catholic thought. We'll develop that when we get into the Fifth Commandment, but it's very limited. Only certain conditions should it be used, and it's almost forbidden, okay? Well, think about tax laws, traffic laws, like a speed trap. Okay, one of the times in my life I got caught for speeding, I got caught by one of those speed cameras in another state. And I remember it. It went from 75 down to 50 in about an eighth of a mile. I got caught. I had to pay it. Okay? Now, I'm all for safety. Did I violate the speed limit? Yes. Do I think it was a bit of a setup? Yes. Ought not be that way. That's not what these laws ought to do. Okay. We could go on because human law is thick. All right. So let's go on from this. Any questions on this? Okay, we'll move on. Constituent elements of morality. Gosh, this sounds very technical and complicated, but worth something, I think, before we get started in the commandments themselves. There are three things, and this is all in the Catechism. I don't know if it's in the compendium. The three constitutive elements of any moral act are the object, the intention, and the circumstance. Okay? Now, I did number them here rather than bullet point them because I'm putting them in order of importance. Sometimes circumstances don't play a role even in what we do, but they may. Okay? Object, the most important thing far and away is, what is it I'm doing? What is the act? Okay? Now, we live in an era where many people think the most important thing is number two, what was your intention? Okay? Let's try to understand intention. Intention's an element essential to the moral evaluation of an action. When we think of intention, sometimes there can be more than one intention in something. But if you think of the intention, it's the primary goal of why you did what you did. Okay? That indicates the purpose of the action you pursued, or maybe the inaction. And it aims at the good anticipated from the action undertaken. You want a good result. Okay? You want a good result. Circumstance, which again sometimes is quite trite, but sometimes can play quite a role here, including the consequences, are secondary elements of a moral act. They contribute to either increasing or diminishing the moral goodness or evil of a human act. So let's say, okay, I'm going to get you guys off the hook since you fell off the wagon for Lent. Let's say I'll start with Laura. Laura is walking down the street by her home, and she sees something fall out of a pocket of someone 100 yards in front of her. Looks like a little piece of paper. She walks along, she sees the paper, she picks it up. It's a $10,000 bill. I don't even know if there is such a thing. $10,000 bill. Now, there might be a passing temptation to do this. But instead, Laura runs forward and says, "Sir, you dropped this out of your pocket." Is that a morally good act? Absolutely. Okay? Absolutely. All right? What would we say? In this act, she returned something of great value to an individual who could have lost this, and it might have had great consequences. Her intention was clearly not selfish. She was clearly taking care of her fellow man. And the circumstance was, well, she could have taken it herself. It would have been easy to pocket it, but she chose not to do it. A selfless act. Wonderful act. Good. Okay? When we consider any act, this is the way we want to weigh it. Okay? Let's start with, let me try an old tested true one. Let's say that, okay, Bart has a heart attack right here in class. Okay? Very clear, all of a sudden he's grabbing his chest, he's sweating, all the symptoms, classic heart attack. What do we need to do for Bart? Call 911. But we have a hospital very close to here, don't we? Methodist Hospital, it's just maybe 2-3 miles. What if we get word that somebody will be here in 15 minutes? Now that's rough in the metro area. Usually our response time is higher than that. So let's say, who's got a fast car in here? Anybody got a car that goes pretty good? You do?
I do.
What kind of car do you have? A BMW. Okay. Nice car. All right. And we're going to say that Laura, normally drives with the racing gloves on. She can handle the car. All right. So we call 911, but they say they won't be able to be here for 15 minutes. So a bunch of us carefully pick him up, put him in the back of your car, and you drive him to Methodist Hospital, breaking the speed limit, probably. What if a cop stops you while you're doing this? What are they going to do? They're going to put the sirens on and say, "Follow me," get you there even faster. Okay. Let's look. The object is, okay, we could get trivial and get off the main topic. We could say, Laura's driving too fast. She's speeding. She shouldn't really be doing that. No, you've missed the point, haven't you? The point is we're trying to save Bart's life. And we can't trust an ambulance to get him there fast enough. Okay. The intention, again, woven into what we're doing pretty much, is save Bart's life. This is pretty, oftentimes these things come together well when they're good moral acts. Okay? That's our aim. That's our purpose. That's why Laura is driving, because she's got the fastest car. She's the best high-speed driver we've got. Circumstance, Bart has had a heart attack, and we've got The quicker we can get him to serious medical care, the better. Okay? Good moral act, not a problem. Same thing occurs. Bart has a heart attack. Laura's never liked Bart. I thought he was kind of a jerk. Okay. And we're going to say Laura knows the West Metro really well. And so, I'll drive him. And what she's doing in her head is calculating, how can I drive Bart in such a way to keep him as far from a healthcare facility as possible so that he will die? Now, physically, it's almost the same act. But what's gone wrong? Well, first of all, the object here has been twisted a little bit, maybe a lot. The intention has gone from very positive to very dark. Okay? She's seeking an opportunity to have Bart die of natural causes. And the circumstances, let's say, are the same. We call 911, but we can't. Oh, I'll take him. Okay, and it doesn't work out. Okay, so again, all things can come into play here. But again, we don't want to try to play games in our head with these things. We want to take them straight on for what they are. Okay? The object is always the primary thing. Good intentions doing something evil. Can they make it better? Maybe. But not good. They might lessen the evil. Okay? They might lessen the evil. But they're not going to make it good. If we look at them in the second scenario with Laura driving Bart wherever, the intention really, this is grave sin. There's no question here. Okay? Very grave. Okay? Circumstance considers the setting of the moral act but cannot reverse the essence of it. It might lessen it. Let's say a terrorist came in the back door back there, okay, with a gun. And I spotted it first because I'm up here looking that way. Now let's create the circumstance. Not true at all. We're going to say that I have a rocket arm. I could throw this water bottle at 150 miles an hour. I'm like beyond a major league pitcher. Okay? Is it okay for me to throw this at that guy to try to hit him? Might it even be a morally good thing? Yes. But let's say there's another circumstance here. I've got a lot of power in this arm, but I've got the wildest arm on earth. And instead, I hit Jennifer in the head and kill her. And I know I've got a really wild arm. In fact, I know that the odds of me hitting this guy are virtually nil. Okay, see how circumstances and so forth can play in. We've got to know circumstance, okay? For an act to be at least neutral, if not good, all three, if the third one is present, need to be on the positive side. I have to do the right thing for the right reason. Probably the best way to put it. Does that make sense? Julia?
What about people who struggle with, you might say sociopathy, or like, those kind of like they're not the altruistic, like, I'm just doing this because I know it's the right thing, or like, 'cause I feel like it's the right thing. Like their intention is just, oh, this is what you're supposed to do in this situation. You're supposed to do the right thing, so I'm just going to do the right thing. Because they might...
But the right thing is not right.
Well, no, it is the right thing, but like that's just their driving force. It's not like they feel like it's the right thing. They're just like, this is just what I've been taught. You just do this. Well, it's not really. It's like
I'm not sure.
Because I feel as though a lot of people, they're like, well, if you're not like, oh, I'm doing this because it's the right thing. I know it's the right thing.
In other words, kind of a feeling-based.
Like instead of like having that driving force of like wanting to do it because it's the right thing, and like you just want to help other people, like altruistic all the way. They're just kind of like, you just do that thing.
Okay. All right. Let me try one I heard of just recently. It's been in the news. Doge. Okay? Now, are people going apoplectic on both sides of this thing? DOGE, this Department of Government Efficiency? Yeah, they are. If any of you are familiar with Babylon Bee, I even saw one the other day. They had a little thing they put out. They do satire. And they had a Civil War soldier who was complaining about being taken off benefits. Now, of course, I remember the night of the State of the Union, if you watched any of it, they were going into the fact that, Social Security's fine, but we've got, people have been collecting. There's one guy they found who's been collecting it longer than the country existed. He's somewhere up around 300 years or something. Or you got to remember, now how long, Social Security, as I recall, was created in the 30s? Does that sound right? I believe? Yeah. So, obviously, somebody got on it despite age and, fraud, okay? And some people say, well, you can't be just focusing on a little bit of fraud. No, you need to, because that fraud is immoral. Why? Because it does harm, because it bankrupts, it helps, it's one of the contributing things to bankrupting the system. So it can't serve people well. But I've seen people all over the place, and again, oftentimes motivated by politics or things like that, or sometimes sentimentality, okay? So again, we can see a great deal of that. So let's plunge ahead here. We also want to talk about, yes?
But none of the circumstances or intentions can ever make an intrinsically, an act that's evil, right? You can't, the
Nope.
intention can't make that okay, can it?
The intention
Can't make an evil, an objectively evil act is just, it's,
An objectively evil act, and we'll get into that as we get into the commandments. Think of it this way. If the commandment says, thou shalt not, you can't do it. Okay? Now, as we'll discover in a number of the commandments, there are more than just the obvious meaning. Not so much tonight in the commandments with God. But for example, when we get into the commandment, thou shalt not steal, there's also a layer in there, you cannot hoard. So people say, well, what about the guy who steals bread? What's the movie or the play? Les Mis, thank you. Okay. You have a hoarder. He can't do that either. So there are some things that have more nuance and may lose a little bit of what we call that pure absolute value. But is it wrong to steal? Yes, because it contributes to the breakdown of society. It robs a person of the right to private property. The right to private property is important in a healthy, free society. Without it, you're not going to have one. Because what happens if you can't have private property? The government owns it all, or the oligarchs own it all. That's not healthy. That's just, we'll develop that a little bit as we go further. But private property is not an absolute right. I don't have the right to, if you're starving for lack of ice cream and I have a bucket full of it, I ought not withhold that from you. Okay? I ought to share. So there's obligations. Good question. Okay, let's slide on a little bit, if we could. Let's talk about, Father probably talked about this a little bit with your night on confession. Did you talk about venial and mortal sins a bit? You're sort of nodding. Okay, he did. Okay, good. All right. Why don't we just give this a look over and see if there's anything up here that, do you understand the difference in character between a mortal and a venial sin? They are distinctly different in what they are. Okay? Anything up there surprising, confusing? Makes perfect sense? No, that's never happened with one of my slides. Okay. Key thing to understand is the character. Venial sins, as Augustine described earlier, they can be like sands of sea, as he once said, they're like grains of sand on the seashore. They're common, okay? The vast majority of sins are venial, okay? Mortal sins are of a very different character because we know we're doing it. We know it's wrong. We know it's seriously wrong. I'm going to do it anyway. We have literally now completely turned away from God. And that, of course, requires the sacrament of confession, penance, or reconciliation to mend that. What if you have a venial sin? What can forgive that?
Contrition.
Could.
In Mass.
Proper reception of communion during Mass, in other words, attentive, that you bring that sin there, and so forth. Yeah, can forgive it. Why? Because you haven't turned completely away from God. Okay? In a serious manner. Okay. Well, great. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that then. Okay, Commandment 1. Okay. The commandments, by the way, are located both in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. In Exodus and Deuteronomy. Okay. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have strange gods before me. From Exodus, I am the Lord your God. A little further development, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now remember, that was proximate to this, the Ten Commandments being given. Okay? Some estimates say 45 days maybe later from the time they'd crossed the Red Sea. Okay. Who brought you out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay. Do we have any other gods? What other gods do we have? Now, Egyptian god, this is an illustration of a child being offered to Baal. You've heard of Baal in the Old Testament. They used to offer their children to Baal, they'd sacrifice them so that it would rain. There was a whole cult developed around that. Okay? Very, very tough. Power, political power. You don't think we have any problems in Washington with political power, do you? We don't have to go overseas necessarily to find the problem, although it exists there too. No. Okay? It is a problem. People seeking power. Okay. Okay. What does this commandment do in keeping God first? By the way, does anybody know the saint I have in the upper middle there? Familiar? Thomas More. Thomas More is a saint of his own age, but a saint of our time. He was killed in the 1500s. He was probably the second or third most powerful man in England under Henry VIII. He was the Chancellor of England. Okay. But Henry tried to force him to go along with the marriage, as it was, when he wanted to dispose of his first wife and marry his second. He ended up having 6. And Thomas resigned. He wouldn't go along with it. And at first he let him be quiet, but then More's stature in the world was so great that, he tried to be quiet. He was a lawyer, and by rights, his silence should have kept him alive. His last words, as he was about to be executed, I die the king's good servant, but God's first. He got this commandment really well. Okay, what is it affirmed? I am the Lord your God who, let's remember what he's done. Let's step away from Egypt, not fresh out of Egypt. He created us in his image. He gifted us with the whole world order for us. It's not just a randomly created thing. He created it for you and for me. And finally, he saved us at the cost of his own life, and he seeks union with us so that we might experience divinization. Okay? Charity loves God above all things. Okay? You want to find a great lover? Find a saint. That's it in a nutshell. By the way, do saints see their own sin? Absolutely. I've known a few people in my life who, I suspect they're not canonized. I can't say I personally know a canonized saint. But if they're not there, I don't know who of us is getting there, kind of folks. And they have a keen sense of their own sin, very keen. Okay, it opposes the strange gods. When we put other things first, that's what it means. So if money is more important to me than my relationship with God, I've got this commandment out of balance. Okay? If, I have kind of false religion, that usually these are religions kind of power, same thing. Okay? I might believe in them. Political power. If we think politics is greater than faith, we're in trouble. Serious trouble. Okay? What does it oppose? Again, those strange gods. Now, some of the things that you've run into in your life, not a complete list, but you'll see these. Polytheism and idolatry. Okay? You're familiar with polytheism? Any of the systems of many gods? We always think of them in ancient times like the Romans and the Greeks, but they were around in the Canaanites, the Egyptians. They're around today in Hinduism. They have, I've heard different stories, 300,000 gods. I even heard someone say 3 million gods. I don't know, okay? I can't count that high. Idolatry, where we put something in place of God, okay? Where we divinize a creature or creation itself. We make the tree out there, that beautiful tree, a god. Well, no, that's created by God. It's not God. Where polytheism always gets creation and the creator confused. They kind of weave them together. Superstition. None of you are superstitious, are you? Never happens? Any baseball players in here? Any of you nobody play baseball? Okay. You ever have any superstitions playing baseball? What's that? Yeah, baseball players are notoriously superstitious. Okay. You get up to bat, you go through the same ritual in the batter's box. Yeah. Why? Because if you break that ritual, you won't hit the ball, right? Yeah, we're giving power to things, or if we think of the classic, don't let a black cat cross your path, or walk under a ladder, or some of the other ones, or the rabbit's foot, you name them. You're giving power to something that has no power. Okay, that's where these things become problematic. It departs. In other words, instead of worshiping, we're giving something else that leverage. Okay. Irreligion, where we just sort of push religion off to the side, if you will, tempting God in word and deed, prone to be sacrilegious. We see this a bit in our secular culture today, where they want to push religion completely out of the public square. That was never the way our country was formed or intended to be. We were never going to have a state religion. That's what separation of church and state, which isn't a religion, that's what it was about. Because the government of England had done that. They had established an official religion, and you had to belong to it. And when we were formed, we said, no, we're not going to do that. Okay? Now, it's been twisted now where, no, you can't bring religion into public life. That was never its intention. But again, that desire for the excessively secular, okay, goes into this. And it oftentimes profanes sacred persons or things. It's dismissive of them at minimum, or literally attacks them. And as you know, churches around the world, but in our own country too, have been under attack in recent years. Atheism, okay, rejects the existence of God. Okay, it's founded often on a false conception of human autonomy. I'm more important than this big fuzzy being up here, and so I'm going to ignore that. I'm the center of the universe. May not say that, but that's the way I'm going to act. Okay, I put myself. Again, pride and ego are greater than reality. And finally, agnosticism. Are you familiar with the term agnosticism, or is that Greek? Okay. Where we can't really know God. Okay. This runs up against a few things. It affirms that nothing can be known about God. Okay, we can't know it. It involves a kind of indifferentism or practical atheism. Practical atheism is simply, oh, I might believe in God. God sort of exists, but I'm going to kind of ignore him and act as if he doesn't. Okay, he has no demands on me. Again, no demands upon me in this kind of belief pattern. And it denies God's gift to us as a person. There's kind of a vagueness about it. Troubling. Okay. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Okay? For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Let's try to get into the core of this particular thing. It fosters respect for God. If you truly love someone in a loving way, you will not speak ill of them. Okay? You will not speak ill of them. You might talk to them about it. Let's say you have a spouse or child or whatnot. You may do fraternal correction, but you try not to publicly rip them apart. It affirms the absolute sacredness of God. One of the problems in our modern age is we've had a tendency to treat God like an extra rather than as God. Well, yeah, he's around somewhere. Justice demands that God be treated this way. Everyone ought to be treated as what they are. Okay? Everyone. Everything. So if I make my dog, I don't have a dog right now, but I've had a number of them through my time. If I treat my dog better than I treat my children, would you say I'm a little crazy? Yeah. No. I'm not quite right here. All right. Over here, got a whole bunch of pictures of various things that are expressions of this. I just put the news media up here. I don't know who these people are, but the kind of two anchors, they spew a lot of garbage at us, and yeah, it's disrespectful often. Miguel Pro, priest in Mexico, when Mexico's government went secular and atheist back around the early 1900s. He was shot. Okay. Pilate speaking to Jesus. Okay, he could have saved him. He didn't. He knew he wasn't guilty of anything, but for political reasons, okay, I'll let you kill him. What's the emperor? I can't. Is it Caligula? I can't remember. I may have it wrong. Christian atheism: reject God but follow Jesus. The kind of madnesses that are out there. St. Peter. What did he do? What's his great sin? He denied Christ. 3 times. Yeah, 3 times. Predicted it. Christ predicted it, and he still did it. Okay. Violated this commandment. Think of the words he said. I don't even know the man. First of all, it's not a lie. Okay. Now, Peter's could be the patron saint of confession. He turned back. Remember that. Osama bin Laden. Now, why did I put him in there? God's will. That's how they were successful. It was God's will. It was God's will. It was God's will. Committing acts of terrorism and things like that. No, that doesn't fly. Anybody know this guy over here? Cardinal McCarrick, former Catholic Cardinal of Washington, D.C., was a serious sexual predator. Ironically, in the background, the World Economic Forum, another one of those institutions we could very well do without, okay? We'll get into why next week. It forbids the misuse of God's sacred name, but let's try to get deeper into it. You cannot call on the name of God to justify a crime. Okay? Can't do that. Okay? Perjury is a grave example of this. You all know what perjury is. When you're testifying or so forth and you're sworn in, you can't lie. Well, I'm trying to protect a friend. No, you can't do that. Why? Because great injustice may come from it. You've got to tell the truth. Okay? Blasphemy, where we utter against God inwardly or outwardly. Okay? Sometimes inwardly in our suffering, we may edge toward this. We got to be careful of that. Words of hatred, reproach, or defiance against God extends to the language against Christ's church, saints, sacred things, to provoke others to repudiate religion. When you probably, those of you who are old enough, probably know somebody who's tried to pull you away from religion, or somebody you know who just seems to want to pull people away. I've known a few people like that in my life. That's a violation of this commandment. Okay? And they even did this, by the way, in the name of Christianity. Okay? I've seen that a number of times. Okay? Cursing. Now, this is probably where a lot of us think this goes in. What does it mean to curse? Yes, wish the devil, wish hell, wish evil upon someone else. Like using God's name. If you use the phrase, forgive me, God damn it. You're asking God to condemn, to curse, or you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we got to be very careful with that. You know, that's not something we ought to do. Again, it's contrary to love. Unfaithfulness, sorry, I got bumped out there when I had to fix to promise in the name of God. In other words, don't make a promise. As God is my witness, I will do this for you. And then you ignore it. No, you can't do that. If you make a solemn promise, if you particularly bring God into it, you must be truthful. Okay? Again, this particularly involves anything under oath. That's where it gets grave. Okay? All right. Let's move on here. We're getting a little bit late. Keeping holy the Lord's day. Okay? From Exodus, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. How do we break this commandment? Or first of all, let's start. What is the Catholic requirement for this day? Okay, we attend Mass. What would be the reasons we wouldn't attend Mass? Illness. Maybe somebody has to be cared for and requires your care.
If you're someplace where there's no church.
Yeah, traveling might necessitate it. Okay. Yeah. What's that? Occasionally a job. Now, this is one thing different from when I was a kid. When I was a kid, you had church Sunday morning only. There were no masses after noon, as I recall. And they started, oftentimes, as early in my area, urban area was, I think, as early as 5:30 we had. Now, how wide is it now? 4 in the afternoon, I think, on Saturday, all the way to, what's the latest Mass in town now? I don't know for sure.
9 at the seminary?
9 at the seminary? I know St. Lawrence used to have a 9. They don't, I don't think they do. University might. Yeah, there's a pretty wide range. So chances are, if you're in the metro area here, you can attend. Yeah, okay. Attendance at Mass is essential on Sundays, and we have several holy days of obligation. There's only several, okay? Used to be more. Used to be like 6, I think, when I was a kid. Anything else on that day?
Well, we're not to do unnecessary work.
Right. Okay, servile work, unnecessary. Now, let's try to get at this just a little bit. We'll take a moment or two. This observance, okay, Christ gave this observance its authentic interpretation. Did Jesus get himself in trouble for violating the Sabbath? A number of times. I think I have it in the next slide. I have the picture where he, you know, there's the, oh, who is it? I can't think of his name, at the well in Jerusalem. The well that bubbles up periodically, and the cripples all go and try to dive in and get cured. It's a superstition. But Jesus goes there on the Sabbath and cures this guy. He's been lame since his youth, okay? So when we think about that, okay, all that, and Jesus did a number of cures on the Sabbath. And they just about, and that's how they would try to go after him. What's wrong here? Well, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath, this day of rest, this day of recreation, this day of worship, set aside from the other days of the week, was given to us from the beginning. The very first chapter of Genesis lays this out. Why? It's for man. We need this. We need a day of rest. Are any of you workaholics? I've been guilty of that at times. Okay? We're Americans. Americans have a gift for this. Okay? How many of you are old enough to remember blue laws?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Those of you who are young, how many of you have no idea what we're talking about? Okay. Jennifer, you're so young. Yes, okay. Blue laws. Most states had laws where you could not keep a business open, and there were variations locally. A business could not be open 7 days a week. So for example, where I grew up, Connecticut, we had at least a modest Jewish population that kind of spilled out of New York. They would have their businesses open on Sunday, not on Saturday. So we had a Jewish delicatessen that we used to stop at on the way home from Mass and pick up rolls for breakfast. That was kind of how it all worked. So life would. But you wouldn't go to the mall. First of all, there weren't many malls around. I mean, you had stores, but most of them were closed on Sunday. Or there was one large Jewish department store that was open on Sundays, not on Saturdays. So if you needed something, you could get it. Ironically, in our day, the only industry that seems to respect this is the auto industry. Car sales are not done on Sundays anywhere that I know of, but I'm not sure why that is, but take our hat off. Or Chick-fil-A,
I think they've looked at repealing that, but the car dealers don't want to.
Yeah.
Because it gives their people a day off.
Day off.
As long as all of them are closed, it's okay.
Yeah, then it's okay.
Well, liquor stores up until
Just a short time ago, right?
Very short time
Yeah.
ago were closed on Sunday.
Yeah. But it used to be kind of a cross.
It was
And I remember as a kid,
total.
Sunday was the day, we went to Mass. We usually had a big family brunch afterward. And then went and visited our grandparents when they were still alive often that day, not every time, or a big family meal. We kicked around, visited. We weren't averse to doing a little work on that day if it was appropriate and necessary. It isn't like in Orthodox Jewry, you couldn't throw that light switch. That's not what it was ever intended to be. Father Grichel, some of you may remember him, he passed away some years ago, but he grew up in the New York area, and he's talked about he had a lot of Jewish friends, so as the Christian boy, he could go in and turn on the lights or turn on the oven for him or things like that on those days. But yeah, that was not the way it's ever been authentically interpreted by Christianity.
How do you do anything on the Sabbath if you're Jewish? You can't even turn on the lights.
It's tough. I mean, it's really tough.
Seem restful or peaceful. That seems like
Mm-hmm.
like my mom told me once they have special devices that keeps it makes their dinner for them or something specifically for the Sabbath, so
Yeah.
they don't have to.
Or they'd pre-cook everything, but yeah, even taking it out of the refrigerator theoretically is work. I mean, it does get a little cumbersome. And I'm not trying to pick on them, but we have to remember, how did that happen? One of the things the Pharisees, they got some things right, but where they really went astray was they elevated the keeping of Jewish law to all the particular things that the Levitical priesthood had to do. They applied that to everyone. That was never intended to be that way. And it became a kind of whip they used to keep everybody in line. So that was very, very problematic, okay? But we do need to keep this day, okay? And I would say in our own time, we've kind of gotten away from it, and Sunday's just another day, okay? It ought not be that. Again, it's the day of new creation ushered in by the resurrection of Christ. This is why it's on Sunday and not on Saturday. I have a dear friend who is a Seventh-day Adventist, and she's a wonderful gal, okay? But as a Seventh-day Adventist, they're Judaizers in Christianity. They go on Saturday to worship. They don't eat pork. They're very much a Christian sect kind of in the Jewish tradition. In other words, Judaism dominates Christianity within their faith. Okay? It's the first of all days and of all feasts. Why? Because it proclaims our eternal rest in God through the resurrection, celebrating the Eucharist and so forth. Again, it's the joy proper to this day. Okay? This is a great thing. It's a holy day. It's a holiday, same word. Okay? It doesn't forbid any kind of work. Necessary work can be done. Anybody in the health field here? Okay? Nurses, doctors, so forth. Yeah. We need to have somebody working in those fields. Firemen, policemen, yeah, we need those. What if something tragic happens? You know, let's say you're a city worker and suddenly the water main breaks and it's flooding water in the middle of the winter all over the place. Well, we're going to wait till Monday to fix that? Could be dangerous. So it encourages, okay, rest, leisure, recreation, take that word apart, to recreate ourselves. In the American South before the Civil War, even the slaves got the Sabbath off. Sometimes we don't give ourselves that anymore, okay? Meditation, silence, study, good works, especially for the sick and the elderly. Great day to go visit them. You didn't have to be at work, okay? And so we had more of that.